That was Rachel's dance to freedom. Rachel was a survivor of political torture who came to the United States as a refugee many years ago. When she arrived, she was afraid, alone, broken, disoriented. She didn't know where she belonged. Amnesty International estimates that anywhere between 140 and 160 countries annually practice torture. The 2014 CIA report on torture documented the United States' involvement in political torture. This was justified for national security. It was justified as enhanced interrogation. All of us watching the news know that we have an international crisis with refugees. We have an international refugee crisis. We are at an all-time high where we have not been since the Second World War in the number of displaced people in the world. 80% of the people who are displaced, refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people, are still in developing countries. Over half of them are children. We have always estimated that between 5 and 35% of refugees have survived torture. In a recent meta-analysis by the Center for Victims of Torture, it was actually documented that in the United States, refugees who have arrived since 1975, that actually closer to 44% are survivors of torture. So instead of approximately 500,000, we now know that 1.3 million Americans are survivors of torture. That means that one of your neighbors, somebody in your community, definitely somebody in your state, has survived torture. Torture is not enhanced interrogation. Torture is a systematic, wanton, deliberate act of abuse by one human being or more against another. Really good torturers intend to send a message to the community that the survivors come from. That message is, you are not in control. We are in control of you. If you tell anybody that you've been tortured, we'll hurt your family. This is how torture survivors are silenced. Really good torturers intentionally do not leave physical scars. They intentionally leave psychological scars that will last a lifetime. Torture undermines some of the most fundamental aspects of what it is to be a human being. Torture is intentional. It occurs in a relationship. That relationship is an abuse of power. The intentionality of torture undermines our ability to feel safe in our bodies and in relationship with other people. It undermines our ability to trust. Those are fundamental to being in relationship. Torture undermines our ability to relate to the world and to actually know where we belong. Really good torturers also intentionally change our body rhythms. They dysregulate the internal rhythms of the body. So things like respiration, heart rate, vascular feedback, digestion, elimination, sleep, wake. All of these rhythms of life are intentionally undermined and sometimes destroyed so that people can no longer relate to the world. When you feel crummy inside, just think about how you may or may not engage with the world. When we don't feel good, we don't go out. We don't connect with people. We don't do the usual things that we love. Torture survivors live with that reality every day. So let me say a little bit about dance movement therapy as a powerful restorative practice for working with torture. As dance movement therapists, we recognize that the body is the site of all human experience. When we work with movement, we are working with the neurological underpinnings of all of our behavior. One of the things that we're learning through all of the current neuropsychiatric research is that trauma, by definition, trauma memory is implicit. That means that we don't necessarily, in fact, we never have a verbal, coherent narrative. Trauma memory is sensory motoric, it's image-based, it's nonverbal. Again, torture intends to silence. So working with movement as a neurological underpinning of all behavior, we can actually access implicit memories. Dance movement therapists have many ways to access the body and movement as a primary and fundamental language. We work with rhythm. We work with breath, which can help calm and regulate the nervous system. We can change and expand movement repertoire so that people can actually have greater emotional expression. So one of the things we're learning from the current neuropsychiatric research is that fear actually changes the brain. So what happens is the gray and white matter shrinks, and we have less neural pathways. The neural pathways that we do have tend to be the ones that are connected to minefields of memories of horror and pain and suffering. Working with movement, with expanded or changed movement repertoire, with rhythm, which regulates, we can actually create new neural pathways. Bruce Perry, who is a very well-known child psychologist, has said that nothing grows the brain better than movement. Working with movement, we actually create pathways, neural pathways that might connect to the past, to the benevolent past, to the memories that somebody has of home or of family. It can also create pathways that help establish us in the present and that perhaps create dreams for the future. So let me come back to Rachel's story. When Rachel arrived to the United States and came to my office, this is how she appeared. Her belly was distended. Her back was tight. Her shoulders were collapsed forward. She couldn't lift her head. She would not make eye contact. When I first sat down with Rachel, I asked her where she wanted to begin. She said, "I want to begin with my pain. As a dance movement therapist, I never want to begin with somebody's pain." She had 2 scars that still oozed pus, one in her right leg and one in her right shoulder. Those scars restricted her movement. She said, "I need to eliminate this pain. I need to get rid of this pain so that I can feel myself again." Not knowing where to begin, I asked Rachel what helped her, and there was only one thing that helped her a little bit. Sometimes if she sat in her bed with a pillow under her right leg, she would get a little bit less pain. So that's where we began. Rachel and I sat in a chair with a big physio ball, and she draped her leg over the ball, and we literally taught her leg how to relax just enough that she could feel a little bit of ease in that leg. As she had less pain in her lower body, she became more aware of the pain in her upper body. So we decided to work with her shoulder. She wanted to restore some flexibility and some strength, so we took stretch bands and did some very simple exercises to restore flexibility and strength. As we worked through that, Rachel recognized that in her shoulders and her arms existed the struggle of 7 years she spent in a prison cell built for 10 women, but holding about 80. So as we continued to work with the struggle in her shoulders, she began to remember stories that had helped her, that she had told herself in her mind. And one day she came in with a Bible, which she had not actually opened in 2 or 3 years. And she asked me if she could read the parable of Job's body. She read Job's body, and when she finished, she looked at me and she said, perhaps I have a purpose." From that moment on, we began to weave together stories from the Bible, stories of her past, stories of green fields, family, of animals in the pasture, some of the stories of torture, some of the stories of horror, the pain, the things that had been done to her. We also talked about simple things she did in her daily life. And then she started to realize that she might actually want to think about a future, a pathway to the future. Rachel and I decided that it was time to establish what the steps were that might actually move her into the future. Her 4 steps were patience, struggle, strive, time. As we worked through each one of those steps over the course of a year, we wove together her Bible stories, her real life stories, aspects of the past, the present, and the future into a narrative that began to help her restore a sense of belonging in this world and make sense of her life and put the horrible things that had happened in the place where they belonged. One day, Rachel showed up in my office with more vitality than I'd ever seen. She was putting almost all of her weight on her right leg, and she looked at me and she said, "I am home. I have come home to my body." And in that moment, Rachel shared something with me that she had remembered about how she survived 7 years in that tiny cell. Every day, at around the same time, a tiny sliver of light appeared on one of the walls. She said there must have been a crack in the other wall. Every time I saw that sliver of light, I knew the sun had come up. I knew there was a day outside. I knew that there was hope. And that was the last move of her dance to freedom. Rachel also showed me something that day that no survivor of torture has ever showed me, and that was the posture that she was forced to assume for 7 years. In that crowded prison cell, Rachel stayed like this to keep as much of her body as possible off the filthy, horrible, disgusting, dirty floor. This posture hid her from the beatings and the rapes and the death that other women were experiencing on a daily basis. As we wove together Rachel's dance to freedom, we integrated all of the stories, the minefields of memories related to her pathway of suffering, of the horrible places that she'd been. Dance movement therapy offered Rachel a pathway to create her dance to freedom. Dance movement therapy showed Rachel the way home. Thank you.